Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Cloud Insiders, the podcast that brings cloud down to earth. Thanks for joining me. I'm Oliver Happy, your host today for this discussion about business continuity and disaster recovery, or DR. As always, head over to cloudinsiders.fm for show notes and in this case to access the free DR toolset provided helpfully by our friends at Databarracks. Let's get into it. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Today I'm joined by Peter Groucutt, the MD of Databarracks, and Peter Grant, who will be known as Pete Grant, the CTO of Xtravirt.
Morning, Ollie.
Morning, Oliver. Nice to be here.
Excellent. Now, thanks for making time for us and looking forward to getting into the content here. So let's begin with you, Peter. For those who don't already know, who are Databarracks and what do you do?
So Databarracks we're a managed service provider, and we specialize in the backup and recovery of IT systems. And we're very keen to kind of point out the difference between, an online backup platform and what we do, which is fully outsource the operation. So we go to companies typically with a high proportion of knowledge workers and a high reliance on their IT systems, but generally with a fairly small IT team to support that. But businesses that really kind of understand the value of their data and they have an attitude which is, look, we would rather focus our technology people on driving innovation and leveraging the technology for the best use that the business can make of it, rather than getting bogged down in the weeds and doing the heavy lifting of backups and disaster recovery. That's where we've come from. So we're a very boutique firm looking at all of the different, changes that people are making to IT infrastructure and how we can innovate around making sure that those systems are always available.
Very good. Thank you. So taking a step back then, just for those who aren't already aware, what is business continuity and why is it important?
Business continuity is, in very high-level terms, the ability of a business to continue serving its customers in the event that it has some kind of disaster or event which would otherwise prevent it from continuing normal operations. And business continuity spans the entire operation of a business. So that can be from a distribution warehouse, logistics of vans and trucks and relocation of people and communication between suppliers and teams and global offices. And where we sit in that is the continuity of the IT systems. So we focus very much on IT disaster recovery and the ability of the IT systems to survive a catastrophe. And we then sit as part of the broader business continuity plans that a company might have.
Okay, so perhaps we should also define disaster recovery and perhaps contrast that with disaster recovery as a service.
So disaster recovery is, as it sounds, the ability of a business to survive a disaster. And I guess we're going to get into what kind of disasters businesses would be planning for. But in high level terms, it's exactly that. Now, what we do is very specific around IT disaster recovery. So disaster recovery, for example, could include a fire at a remote office that would constitute a disaster, would invoke a disaster recovery plan, and that may or may not include the IT disaster bit, which would be dependent on whether there was any systems involved in the building, etc. So the business continuity piece is a very high level structured process which governs the ability of the business to continue trading. Disaster recovery is then the very specific parts within that business continuity framework of how to recover from disaster. The IT disaster recovery sits within the disaster recovery bit and is how to recover from a failure of IT systems from whatever event caused that. And just to rewind, Oliver, it occurs to me that I never actually answered your initial question, which was why is it important? And that's really more and more businesses, of course, nowadays are becoming more and more reliant on their IT infrastructure. We look at collaboration and communication and enterprise resource planning and HR and finance systems as being pretty much digitized across the vast majority of industry now. And really to lose some, any or all of those systems for any prolonged period of time soon starts impacting and hitting the bottom line of a company. So the quicker that we can put a business back on its feet, the smaller those losses are, and the greater chance that a business will continue to trade after a catastrophic event.
Right. Okay. So what sort of market factors and emerging issues and threats have led to this focus on continuity? Because it's something that's certainly a buzzword in the media.
I mean, it's always been there, is the honest truth. I mean, I remember doing DR tests when I worked in a bank many years ago, and we would all go from one building to another building, and we'd plug ourselves in and we'd get ourselves working. And really, when we started Databarracks some 15 years ago, what we spent a lot of time talking about was, the fire, the flood, pestilence, and it was really around protecting the physical infrastructure that people had running their applications. Fast forward on a couple of years, the risks started to change somewhat. Virtualization kind of went from being something used broadly in test and dev into production environments, and the risks were much more around, we were seeing disasters where people were doing firmware upgrades on their SANs, for example, and that was causing some kind of corruption. And the risk was very different. What you'd gone from is you'd have a physical server that went pop and saw somebody made a mistake, and you'd lose a piece of an application or all of an application. Whereas in the era of virtualization and widespread adoption of that, you could have a problem with a SAN that could replicate even if you had high availability, and that would take all of your workloads down. So the mitigation strategies that we started to employ started to be different. Now what we're talking about, the biggest threats are around the cyber security. There are many reasons for this. One of the major ones, of course, is that is that mass crime is going online. The days where we can go back to war games and disenfranchised youth sitting around trying to hack into corporate systems for giggles and for their own kind of reasons have gone. There's a lot more organized crime involved now. I think the rewards are very large. The risks are, are pretty small. The attacks are getting much, much more sophisticated. And that's only going to increase. I think 75% of UK businesses had some kind of cyber incident last year. And still, the vast majority of those were some kind of human error. So the ability for businesses to be tripped up now are very real. And also one of the biggest problems, of course, is that the most vulnerable people within the business are the most senior people. So what we're seeing is we're seeing less mass email, hoping to get one person tricked into clicking on a link. We're now going to very targeted spear phishing attacks. It's much easier to profile somebody who's senior. There's a lot more information available. You can tailor one email with a very high chance of pressing the right buttons to get an action happening. And if you do have that, the reward is much greater. Senior executives, they have much wider access to sensitive systems. So if it's a crypto virus, they're going to be able to infect many more systems. If it's a piece of spyware, then obviously what you've got is you've got much more juicy information being key logged from your senior execs than you have from your junior admin. So that's the biggest threat that we're facing at the moment. And of course, what people tend to ignore is that those threats don't really care where you are. They don't. Our traditional mitigation strategy was one of, well, look, we've got a data center, we've got servers which are sat in a comms room in our office or a data center. The reality is that we were wildebeest in the middle of the herd, if you like. Our greatest defense was our anonymity. Now, of course, people are adopting hyperscale clouds. People want to, and quite rightly so they should, leverage Azure and AWS and others. But of course, what we're creating with that is a watering hole where actually everybody is now congregating and gathering. So what we're unable to do as businesses is we're able to assess our own risk and our own likelihood of attack, but we're not able to understand the risks that other people who we might be sharing a sharded instance of a hyperscale cloud, what their risks are. So we can't adequately defend ourselves. There's a very new era of changing threats, and businesses, to my mind, aren't really addressing that properly. We're saying there's a cyber risk, but actually, the cyber risk, the spyware risk versus the crypto virus risk versus the distributed denial of service, they're all very different risks, and their mitigation strategies are very different. So there's still a lot of work to be done, I think, to get certainly small businesses and medium-sized businesses into a position where they can effectively mitigate against that.
All right, thanks for that. And I think the main thing that often comes up for people in hearing about risks and what should be done in best practice to prevent those and to lower those risks is that will never happen to me. So if we take it back to the realities, we know it does happen, and the statistics that you've mentioned certainly indicate that. But Pete, what sort of impact have you seen disaster recovery having on client business over the last couple of years? Because something that I think people often think when they hear about the need for continuity planning and the need for disaster recovery is that'll never happen to me.
Disaster recovery has always been an area that organizations know they should address. But the age-old problem with disaster recovery is, how do I do this in a cost-effective manner, but also in a way where it will actually work if I need to push the button. And this is where we're seeing customers really find cloud-based solutions to be very cost-effective and much more practical than, say, dual data center approaches. So historically, our customers, particularly the ones in finance, have gone down the dual data center approach, where you have a standby data center essentially powered down and a massive amount of costs that goes with that, and then also it's very hard to test. But now we're seeing our customers look to utilize cloud-based solutions where they can essentially rent some disaster recovery space but not pay the full dollar for it, and also utilize technologies to allow them to test them, albeit in isolation. So one of the questions I had for Peter was, are you seeing customers opening up to using more cloud-based solutions versus on-prem? Because 3-4 years ago there was a bit of a stigma around cloud, and people didn't really trust it, and it was all a bit suspicious. Are you seeing a change in the sort of psyche of the customers in the industry?
Definitely, that's the case. I think the adoption curve has been marred with a bit of hesitation and reluctance, but I think mass adoption is now there. And interestingly, I think the initial part was perhaps the the technical departments within companies being, uncomfortable perhaps about letting go of the infrastructure layer that they built up over many years.
If I can just touch on something you said at the start of this, which was about, organizations and IT departments and CIOs don't really want to necessarily spend their time and effort having people doing the lower level operations and keeping the lights on. They want to focus on using IT and technology for innovation. And I think that's quite a good message for IT people out there listening to this, is that times are changing, as IT always does. And I think the way I view IT and cloud adoption isn't so much that it's threatening your ability to work on IT, but it's offering new opportunities to maybe work slightly further up the stack. And I think it's it's an opportunity for people to update their skill sets and appreciate that maybe some of the infrastructure work is going to be outsourced to cloud providers, but it just means there's an opportunity to upskill and focus on areas further up the stack.
Okay, and I completely agree with that. I think there's so much innovation around, leveraging the systems, the applications, and the data that businesses use for, much better effect. And I think the technical departments can really be at the, at the center of kind of driving those changes of efficiency and how to make customers and businesses work better, and leveraging the application layer for much better effect. And I think once you get rid of the flashing lights, there's a new level, as you say, of working up the stack that becomes available. Just to touch on one of the points that you made, Pete, as well, which I thought was really interesting and valid, is DR as a service absolutely is the kind of perfect fit for the cloud model, where traditionally you were saying, look, cloud, it allows you to put more resource higher up the stack and drive efficiencies back and innovation back into the business using technology. The reality is what you're doing from a cost perspective is you're aligning your usage exactly with your capacity. So you're getting over that standard depreciation cycle of saying, well, look, I'm buying infrastructure now and I'm going to depreciate that over 3 to 5 years. So I've got to make a judgment on capacity now based on what I feel the business is going to need in 3 years' time. And actually, really, I'm either going to over provision to be safe, which means I'm overspending, or I'm going to under provision, which means that if the business grows, we're going to be having to add and upgrade kit before actually we were ready to. So that's a good argument. But with DR, it really is an absolutely perfect financial fit, because 99% of the time, that kit is idle and you're turning down your CPU and you're turning down your RAM to, as close to zero as the replication workloads will allow. But then should you have a disaster or your biannual DR test, you're just turning that up and you're only really incurring any kind of compute and RAM charges for those points in time. It's very much like a story I heard from a CTO at one of the charities where he was explaining the problem that Comic Relief had, where they'd built this kind of £4 million infrastructure and they just didn't know what to do with it for the 350 odd days of the year outside the kind of couple of weeks that they were hammering it, but they didn't have that choice. And DR really kind of fits into that bracket of cost efficiency as well.
So perhaps just touching on the cloud-based model, how are you seeing clients move towards using that? Peter?
For our SME customers, the adoption is largely with Azure, and people are very comfortable with that. They're comfortable with the technical stack. And so really a lot of businesses, they don't want to reinvent the wheel. They just, they feel very comfortable. And some of our larger businesses, they want to re-architect, and especially around kind of web scale, they really want to be using Amazon. And some people, or a lot of people that, we talk to, do have that attitude, well, look, we're going to architect it and it's Microsoft's problem or it's Amazon's problem. We're not going to protect those workloads. We have sometimes quite, spirited debates, obviously, about why they should make sure that no matter where they're going, they have adequate protection. Mainly because of the cyber threat, but also you want to be able to have some kind of, resilience outside these hyperscale clouds, in our opinion, at least anyway.
Okay, so if we just touch on that, if you were talking to the management team and perhaps even some of the technical team of one of these businesses, and they were starting to think about putting in place some best practice business continuity, what would that involve?
So really, we would always start from the other way and do the business impact analysis and the gap analysis. So really, normally when you start with those two basic elements, then everything else becomes clear. A lot of people, what they do is they mitigate for the risk. So they're not mitigating for the impact of that risk. We can go in and we can talk to businesses about their critical services, and we start really at the application layer and the service layer, and we say we understand what's the impact of not having your HR system available or your payroll system available or your accounting system. And sometimes, depending on the business, they can be really small. You can go into a very large business and say, what happens if you don't have your payroll system? And of course, it could depend on the time of the month that they lost it. But quite a lot of people have an attitude of saying, well, we'd just phone up the bank and we'd pay everybody exactly what we paid them last month. And then we would worry about the anomalies, should there be any. But really, by understanding the services that the business consumes, you can understand then the risks that are pertinent to those systems. And then we can map out the mitigation strategies around that. We very rarely talk with the business, certainly, about technology. And certainly when we're talking to the board, they really don't care what Active Directory server or what app cluster or what bit of what SAN drives their ERP system. But what we should be able to say is, look, we can disaggregate the service that the business uses to the underlying infrastructure layer. And we will just sit and we'll say, your CRM or your ERP platform, how long can it be down? How long can the business operate and continue without that? And that will then inform the technology that we will implement to meet the RTOs, and also inform the kind of the risks that are available to that system. And as well as that, it also has a huge benefit of getting the buy-in of the business as well as the technology teams, because largely technology teams will go to the business and they'll say, we want to spend this money to protect the underlying IT infrastructure. And the business will see it as an IT cost and budget it as such. But really, if the business kind of see it as more of an operational imperative, it empowers the technology teams to put in best practice around that.
And that's good to hear. I mean, I'm sure, Pete, that you'd be glad if most decisions on technology and strategy began in the boardroom rather than with technical.
Yeah, I think reality is somewhere in between.
Indeed. Okay, so Peter, when a business is looking at continuity and starting to plan for it, what are some of the common mistakes that you see people making that you would like to make them aware of when they go into this process?
I think the biggest one is the one that I touched on before. One of the most common mistakes is that people plan for risk events. They don't plan for the impact that those events have. And what I mean by that is people would plan for a fire or a flood or a riot, as we had in London a few years ago. Whereas actually what people should be planning for is the outcome, a fire and a flood. We've lost access to our underlying IT infrastructure. So that's the impact. And that mitigation is the strategy. And I think the reason for that is that there are a lot of risks. There's probably somewhere between 60 and 75 risks that we see on the London Risk Register that our vast majority of our customers plan for. But the impact of those risks are probably 10 or 20. So plan for impact, not for risk, is one of the main pieces of advice we would give. Some of the others would be when you're analysing risk, a lot of people just won't give due deference to the different aspects of risk. And again, I touched on this before. So a cyber risk. Okay, what does a cyber risk look like? I mean, cyber risks are very, very different. A DDoS attack, social engineering, spear phishing, a crypto virus. They're very different in their impact and they're very different in their mitigation strategy. So make sure that you're addressing the right risks in the right way. And finally, but by no means least, this is the key to the whole shooting match really, which is test. You need to test and test regularly. Don't test to a run book. Stick to your run books and make sure that the run books are fit for purpose, and test in anger. Don't do soft testing. Make sure that you are testing when the impacts to the business could be the greatest. A lot of businesses will say, well, no, we're not going to test now because it's the end of the month. We're not going to test now because we've got this big client project going on. We're not going to test now because the CTO is on holiday. Well, actually, you need to test to a reality that you need to be prepared for. So those are some of the kind of the key takeaways, I think, that I would leave people with.
Okay, very good. And in terms of the mistakes you see people making, I guess it would be the inverse of each of those, that they're soft testing, that they are not thinking about the impact, but are thinking about the risk.
Yeah, mistakes people make certainly around the lack of understanding. I mean, we see people who make decisions based on a set of criteria without taking continuity into account. And what I mean by that is you might be a hedge fund and you might say, well, look, actually, we need to keep our financially regulated data for 7 years. But actually, we've got a lot of data here which doesn't have a regulation. And to save costs, what we're going to do is we're just going to put a retention rule on that of 2 years or a year. And then you're hit by a crypto virus. And you don't have a regression strategy of getting that data back effectively. So those kind of tabletop testing of scenarios is very good to augment a test. And what people sometimes overlook is the fact that backing up data and replicating data is incredibly easy to do. And, and it's one of the arguments that we make when we go out to the market is, look, anybody can do the BAU bit of what we do, but what really is very difficult is bringing up a 25 server estate or a 50 server estate or 100 servers or even even just a 3 server cluster and delivering services back to a business in the event of a disaster. So I think understanding the complexities of restoration is very big. And also, I think a lot of people don't realize that when they are in a disaster, the last thing that they want to be doing is creating a split brain. So
what do you mean by
for
that?
example, so what I mean by a split brain is if you have a widespread IT system failure, you don't want your IT team bringing up, managing and focusing on your disaster recovery. You want them to be focused on fixing the problem in production and getting your main systems back up and running and operational. So a lot of people, when they look at doing DR themselves, they look at, well, yes, actually, we could do that quite easily. We have the skills in-house. It's not that complicated. But what they don't fully understand is their ability to manage both a recovery of the DR infrastructure and the troubleshooting and problem solving of the production at the same time.
I see. Thank you. All right. In closing, where do you see the future heading in terms of business continuity planning and DR and the cloud?
Well, certainly when we talk about our roadmap, we generally work to 36-month innovation cycles. So our big innovation in the last 12 and for the next 2 years is going to be around adding new innovation to our cyber resilient DR as a service platform, and our work around both DR as a service into Azure and into AWS, from AWS to Azure, and really giving people the ability to manage those continuity of workloads across hyperscale clouds. And then beyond that, really, I think it does become around much more of a complexity around data silos and interconnectedness of software as a service, business process as a service, and platform as a service. People want to use Salesforce, and Salesforce is going to be connected to Eloqua or Marketo, and we want to use Xero as our accounting system, and we want to use Box, and we want to have Microsoft Office 365. And actually, as we move into that world, what we need to be able to understand is the threat again is going to change. We don't think we're going to lose all of our systems, but what we need to understand is in a cloud-connected world and a SaaS-based world, what the impact to the business and the mitigation strategy of losing certain elements of our ability to deliver services to our customers. It's an interesting future, and one that I think is going to have its challenges, but also it's going to be interesting to solve.
Yes, agreed. Now, in terms of finding out more and hearing more of what you have to give in terms of advice, I'm aware that you have a podcast, I believe.
Yes, we do. So what we have started to put together, and I think our first episode is out now, and we've got others in the pipeline, is a podcast which basically brings business continuity and disaster recovery professionals together and to just share insights and best practices and stories of when they got things right and when they got things wrong, lessons learned. And it really is just, a kind of high level sharing of views from the coalface and from people that have been in continuity and risk management for many, many years.
Very good. And as I understand it, it is called the Business Continuity Podcast, which is easy to remember.
Yeah, that's right. And yes, can be found at thebcpcast.com.
Very good. And I believe that you can be found at databarracks.com.
We can be found at databarracks.com, and I can be found at Peter Groucutt on Twitter, and anything that I can do to inform the conversation, or if anybody wants to get in touch with me and find out a little bit more about disaster recovery and business continuity services, and I'd be more than happy to chat.
Very good. Pete, any final comments or questions before I wind things up?
Yeah, I think it's been great from my side. I've got no further questions, but I'd certainly like to maybe have some conversations following this.
Very good. Peter, thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughts, and see you next time.
Oliver, it's been very good to speak to you, and thanks ever so much for inviting me on. It's much appreciated.
It's a pleasure. That brings us to the end of another episode of Cloud Insiders. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. And to find out more and access show notes and downloads, head over to cloudinsiders.fm. You can track us on Twitter at Cloud Insiders, and we'd love you to leave us a review on iTunes. See you next time. This episode was brought to you by Databarracks, leading provider of cloud infrastructure, disaster recovery, and backup services. To find out more, head over to databarracks.com.